Black Mesa was an unusual phenomenon. In a world where Half-Life seemed all but dead, this fan-made remake of the original game from Crowbar Collective was by far the largest piece of content we had to look forward to. Various iterations of the game were released to the public over the course of 8 years, finally culminating in a 1.0 version on Steam, taking the game out of early access. The game has received considerable praise for the way it updates the mechanics and visuals of the original for the modern day, with some reviewers going so far as to call it the best way to play Half-Life. And with the recent release of Half-Life Alyx, an awful lot of people will be playing this series for the very first time. When presented with 3 versions of the original, which one will they choose? They'll want the version that gives them the best experience. But the problem is, Black Mesa isn't the best experience. It isn't the best way to play Half-Life. Before we begin, we should get an understanding of what Black Mesa's goal is. Thankfully, there's a not-so-subtle allusion to this in the game itself.
You're living in the past. That experiment is single-handedly responsible for inspiring my career in science.
How much recognition do you think you're going to get for reproduction, though?
You should focus on inventing something new and unique.
He does have a point.
Oh, but this is more than a replication, I assure you. For one, it shows how far our field has come since the original study was published, and to say nothing of the modern perspective necessary to monitor its influence. I mean, combined with today's technology, I've recreated— Bah! I can't stand to hear another word of this malarkey.
Don't mind him. But here's something to think about for the next time.
You and your sugar-coated ersatz are absolutely full of it.
Creativity is the art of hiding your influence. Now let's get back to work. We should at least try to look busy.
Effectively, Black Mesa is aiming to reimagine Half-Life and bring it up to the standards of modern games. It wants to be what the Resident Evil remake was to the original, but unfortunately, it fails in this regard. While it's a fine enough game on its own, Black Mesa fails as a remake, losing so much of what makes the original so great. Now, the point of this video isn't to tell you not to play Black Mesa, or to place a curse on your bloodline if you do. This video exists as a counterbalance to the praise, something that points out where the original succeeds and the remake fails, and for that, there's no better place to start than in the game's combat. Half-Life's gameplay is very similar to Quake's. You run fast and shoot faster. Where the combat differs from earlier games is in the way the enemies react. Artificial intelligence was a large focus of Half-Life's development, and it shows in the final product. Combat is effectively controlled by the NPCs, because while they have a very high damage output and rarely flinch, they can't attack and move at the same time. You have to figure out when you need to fall back and when it's safe to advance. The most common enemies have built-in methods to make the player move so they aren't able to sit in one place for an entire battle. Almost all of the enemies can be a real challenge and make the player feel like the odds are stacked against them. Black Mesa tries its hardest to land a similar balance, but it never quite reaches it. It uses Half-Life 2 as a basis. The most common enemies for most of the game, human grunts, act very much like the Combine, who were never as fun to fight as the soldiers of the original. Their behavior has been improved over the years, but maybe it's been improved too much. Soldiers are now so good at their jobs that the player rarely gets a good opening to attack. They can fire while moving, meaning they can shift positions while you're behind cover. Often, they'll fire at where you're going to be endlessly to pin you down while other members of the squad come in. This is pretty much your only chance to fight back, and you'd better pray that a grenade never lands at your feet. Certain large-scale fights in chapters like Surface Tension have been made far too difficult. In this one, the player gets to choose how they want to approach the fight from a series of tunnels. In the original, there's a soldier at the end of all of them who can be taken out before they even notice you, immediately giving you an advantage. But in Black Mesa, the sheer amount of them makes this impossible, and gives the player much less wiggle room to approach the fight in a way they find fun. Only one entrance is clear of soldiers, but
Systems engaged.
But its sheer openness means you'll be assaulted by at least 9 of them within moments anyway. None of these issues are helped by the sluggishness of the game. In Half-Life, by default, Gordon runs. Holding shift will slow him down to a walk that's really only useful one time in the game. Black Mesa uses modified Half-Life 2 movement, which works in the opposite way, and removes the one mechanic that gave it purpose. You weren't allowed to sprint for very long in the sequel, which meant that you would only use it when needed in combat. The rest of the game was fairly compact as a result, or gave you vehicles for the bigger, more open areas. Black Mesa removes the sprint meter, rendering the entire feature pointless unless your pinky really likes the shift key. Thankfully, they've added an always run option in the settings, but activating that will make other areas that have been significantly altered feel worse in the same way. The arsenal has been nerfed. Weapons fire more slowly, have greater spread and recoil, and hold less ammo. There was a real satisfying feeling to firing the MP5 in the original, hearing its rough and impactful sound as it sprays bullets like a hose. And the remake just doesn't capture that feeling. And on top of all this, the copy-pasting of so many arenas from the original that don't even remotely fit the new combat mechanics turns some areas into a full-on mess. It's very frustrating, because on the occasions that Black Mesa does heavily alter the original's design, it can be rather fun. This fight outside the Rocket Control Center, for example, is far more interesting than in the original. Other times though, such as the added battle in the end of questionable ethics, the game becomes even more punishing and even less fun. Next to no cover and the massive amount of enemies it just throws at you, as well as the ones on the roof covering nearly the entire arena, makes this one of the most unfair battles in the entire game. But hey, at least you can jib people with the shotgun. But of course, combat wasn't all Half-Life had to offer. Puzzle solving and navigations were its other major focuses, but sadly, Black Mesa hasn't retained the fun of those either. Puzzles in Half-Life weren't exactly common, and generally required little more than messing around with the game's mechanics to solve. Things like pushing boxes to make a platform were novel at the time, and took a bit of thought for a player base that hadn't seen physics like this in a video game before. Black Mesa is keen to add more puzzles wherever possible, but they're rarely creative or interesting enough to justify their inclusion. It really likes to use plug puzzles, and valve puzzles, which are pretty much just plug puzzles with an extra step. These are ripped straight from Half-Life 2, which used these types of puzzles as an end goal in navigation. The player was guided by chords, and the whole concept was really just another showcase of the Source Engine's abilities. There, however, it wasn't all the technology did to add to the gameplay. In Black Mesa, plug puzzles are used for, well, I'm not really sure. This moment isn't enhanced by adding plugs. Neither is this part. The worst offender is probably this puzzle here. In the original, the player would turn on this laser, see it blocked by the shield, observe the room around them, see this sign, and eventually work out that moving this box to block the shield will allow the player to fire through the wall. This was probably the best use of physics on objects in the entire game. In Black Mesa, the player will try the laser, see it get blocked by the shield, then they'll pull out the plug and blow up the wall. It seems rather odd to trivialize this when Black Mesa usually prefers to challenge the player even more than the original. In Half-Life, this section had the player walk down a hallway, and the only reward for exploration was extra ammo and early grenades. In earlier versions of Black Mesa, the same place required players to go to the side area in order to open a new route around the hallway. Then, a later update decided to add a spot where you need to crawl under the floor to get to that side area. Is this necessary? No. Does it add anything? I mean, kind of. The most recent version adds a tiny tutorial for the plug puzzles, but it just doesn't need to be here, and only serves to extend an already elongated game even further. This crops up all over the place in Black Mesa. A new long vent here, a few more closed doors there, some extra floors to climb, things like that. Navigation is often confused by the added detail to the environments. Half-Life's minimalist design naturally gave players only a few options to proceed. Half-Life 2 put more effort into telegraphing goals and reducing clutter where necessary, and Black Mesa just adds so much visual noise that it can be difficult to find what to do, even for those who've played the original. Take this scene in Surface Tension that we looked at earlier. This room behind the tank has a fenced-off area with a door, and interactable switches to move these lifts up and down. These things do exist in a later section of the original, but serve no purpose here. Then there's this section of the wall that the tank blew up. It's pointless as well. Maybe you go up here to this door? Nope. Maybe up the ladder to this door. Nope. Oh, what about the bright orange doors? Nope. The solution is to go into this little shed next to the big door. No, not that one. The other one. No. Hotter. Colder. Warmer. There you go. Go into this tiny shed and hit the button to open the door. Back in the original, there was one button next to a shed, more visible throughout the entire arena, and no other options. A similar issue comes up in the Lambda Complex assassin fight, where an area that was already somewhat unclear only gets worse. There are certainly areas where the original could have been improved upon, but Black Mesa rarely does. A big example would be the entire residue processing chapter, one that's heavy on swimming and platforming, doesn't provide much of a challenge, and doesn't add a whole lot to the game. If there was any chapter that could have used more interesting puzzles, it was this one, yet Black Mesa only adds one on top of what was there in the original. But hey, at least it looks a lot better, right? Black Mesa straight up looks better than Half-Life. At least, it looks better than what you get when you buy Half-Life on Steam. This is because the settings are all terrible. It's in 4x3 with HD models turned on, and the lighting is all but ruined. Adjusting a few simple settings can work miracles for making the game look good, and changing the lighting to the settings shown here using the console gives the game its intended look. Half-Life relies heavily on deep shadows to provide an atmosphere. Here's the lead writer saying as much. With these settings, and a bit of help from concept art, we can see the look Half-Life was going for. Dark and moody, industrial, yet almost a little cartoonish in places. It wasn't attempting to be as realistic as possible, otherwise the characters would look less like this, and a little more like this. The tone that it took fit this style perfectly, and much of Half-Life comes off as a dark comedy. Watching these people who are supposed to be some of the greatest minds in the world crawl in a vent to their death or fail to do a single pull-up. Meanwhile, again taking cues from Half-Life 2, Black Mesa doesn't attempt full-on realism, but it certainly trends further in that direction. I'd call this a pretty big missed opportunity, because leaning further into the style of Half-Life and its concept art could have produced some great results. There's an artist named Decepticoin posting a lot of art based on moments in the game, and some of the more intense designs really lean into the cartoon horror story vibe of the original in a way that would have been amazing to see in motion. But it's not as if the direction Black Mesa took is inherently flawed. In fact, it looks really good in a lot of places, especially the outdoors, with these bright, warm colors. The problem comes in with the rest of the game. In Half-Life, the facility uses cooler colors, giving a very blue and green look to it. It adds to its horror-oriented sections, and contrasts nicely with the surface sections of the game, giving each chapter their own sense of identity. Black Mesa bathes the underground in a sickly orange color, fitting for a building on fire and likely filled with smoke, but makes the game far less appealing to look at. And can we take a moment to talk about lens flares? They're fancy and they look nice in screenshots, but do we really need this? Who asked for this? It even creeps into sections of the game that do look good, like questionable ethics. The chapter looks almost perfect for the most part, until you reach a long hallway and see the nasty orange fog waiting for you on the other end. But visuals aren't the only aspect of a game's presentation. Black Mesa fares far better in the sound department. While they're nowhere near as iconic or memorable as those from the original, they get the job done and convey what they're supposed to. Most of the voice acting is fantastic, though there are a few lines where it feels like the actors are forcing the same pronunciation as the original.
I don't know how you can say that. Although I will admit that the possibility of a resonance cascade scenario is extremely unlikely.
And it's hard not to find the shift of the intercom's voice from calm to evil just a little bit comical.
Attention. System now under military command.
Attention. This announcement system now under military command.
Black Mesa has become renowned for its soundtrack, which is brilliantly composed and worth listening to on its own, but the music doesn't feel at home in the game it's in. Sometimes it plays at odd times or feels overly dramatic. And quite frankly, sad piano just doesn't fit Half-Life. And yes, I'd say the same about Triage at Dawn, overused piece of shit. It's not all bad though, many tracks still do fit right in with what's seen on screen and match the tone set in the original. Putting together my complaints, you may think that I'd want to see the reverse, keep the same fundamental gameplay as the original, and the same visual style and atmosphere, while changing the level design to give the game its own true sense of identity. In theory, I think this could work, though I'm not confident that Crowbar Collective would be up to the task. Actually, before we get to that, this video was getting pretty long, so I figured I'd add in a bit of an intermission here. Let's talk about the reason Black Mesa was made in the first place, because I'd rather not give this an entire video of its own. If you already know about Half-Life Source, you can skip ahead, there are timestamps in the description. But for everyone else, Half-Life Source was Valve's own attempt to put the game on the Source engine. It implemented Source's lighting, physics, ragdolls, water, and small details like explosions and bloodstains. You can still buy the port on Steam for the same price as the original, but you shouldn't. See, back in the day, this was really just a disappointing game that offered very little the original didn't have. But over the years, as the Source engine has evolved and updated, this game has been left to rot. Visually, while certain aspects do look better, I find them out of place, and every now and then there will be something like these lights that just looks terrible. Then there are some minor problems with weapons. The crowbar looks gross, the revolver can zoom in like in multiplayer, and the shotgun uses the same sound effect on the alt fire. Oh, and we can't forget about the flying scientist. The more glaring gameplay problems come in the form of broken barnacle tongues, whatever evil spirit has made its way into this map, and the complete removal of the main hazard for an entire chapter. This might be my favorite, because it applies to the title screen as well. There are other broken features and videos that go more in depth on this port, but in short, don't bother with it. This lazy port and the response to it led the fans to do it themselves, and nearly 20 years later, we have Black Mesa. Back to that. Most of Black Mesa's departures from Half-Life's design result in a worse experience. I've already touched on the plug puzzles, the changes to the AI, and a few minor areas like this, and I'd like to add that the first two encounters with the alien grunt no longer allow you to learn how they function, as you straight up kill the first one, and the second two are obscured from the area you'll likely be viewing them from. Pacing is a massive problem because of how many areas are expanded and added in that don't need to be there. In the original, there were only 5 soldiers to fight between getting the Tau Cannon and the helicopter battle, which served as both the climax to questionable ethics and an introduction to surface tension. Between the Tau Cannon and the helicopter in Black Mesa, there are 41 spread across 5 fights, and none of these are particularly well done or memorable either. They really just serve to soak up bullets and make the game take longer. Then there's crouch jumping. The original game featured crouch jumping, which was an unnecessary but fun way to give platforming an extra layer of depth. I liken it to the gravity gloves in the newest entry. There isn't any real reason not to simply teleport things into the player's hands, but the need to catch things in midair adds a layer of immersion to the mechanic and becomes satisfying to pull off. Black Mesa has crouch jumping too, but a setting that automates it is switched on by default. Apparently it was added because crouch jumping is antiquated, and Darkside Phil had issues with it.
Now what the fuck do I do?
I can understand adding the option, but perhaps enabling something that flat out removes some of the skill needed by default is a little bit much. The reason DSP had issues with this wasn't just because he's terrible at video games, though he certainly is.
My thumb is fucking killing me for pressing jump so much. I'm not even kidding, my thumb is killing me. I didn't even fucking do that.
It was also because the prompt for it appears once and the mechanic isn't used again for another half hour. The original solved this by using a training mode that was helpful and added to the lore of the game, but Black Mesa never included this. Fortunately, a team has recreated the entire thing as a mod.
Climbing ladders in your suit may be a bit tricky. Take some time to practice it here.
I can't believe they still think we need to teach people how to use ladders.
To wipe your ass, first orient your hand behind yourself, then move it forward. Or backward.
And it's a treat to play on the old 2012 release of the game. But workshop support on today's Black Mesa is so... Okay, so while I was making this video, Crowbar Collective added a new major update to the game's beta branch. They fixed the workshop, which is great, and opens up the door for all kinds of changes to be made across the entire game. But it doesn't seem like any of my other major problems have been addressed at all. I'll do a follow-up video in the future to go over the update in more depth. But anyway, back to the point. What if the mindset behind changes like this were applied to an entire chapter of Black Mesa? On a Rail was always a divisive chapter. Its length, usage of the cart, electrified rails, and looping maps were frustrating for many players and led to a lot of complaints. It's totally understandable to rework this chapter, but that's not really what Black Mesa did. Instead, it simply removed huge chunks of the chapter and replaced them with a plug puzzle and a few extended fights. This comes off as a really odd choice to me, because every chapter before this was nearly identical, especially Blast Pit and Power Up. On a Rail is meant to feel like a long journey through a massive, abandoned section of the facility. It's filled to the brim with memorable moments that are cut or altered for the worse in Black Mesa. This is gone, and this is gone. Much like the rest of the game, there were two choices here: keep the chapter nearly the same or rework it into a greater experience. Instead, the entire thing has been stripped down to the point where the rocket ending hardly feels like an achievement at all. The strangest part of all of this is that a member of the team made a mod that restores so many of these moments and adds a few of its own, as well as a similar mod for surface tension before being hired. Surface tension was added, and as a result is one of the best parts of the game, but On a Rail wasn't updated. Thankfully, the mod can be downloaded on the Steam Workshop, and I'd recommend giving it a shot. The reason cited for not including it was a general lower quality than the rest of the game, but personally, I find it much more fun than a lot of what's in here, and it's certainly better than nothing at all. Now, everything I've talked about so far only applies to the Earthbound section of Black Mesa, the part that's remained mostly the same since 2012. That's because Zen is a very different subject. It was made by a more established team, the game was being sold on Steam, and it's become the primary selling point of the game. Crowbar Collective put their all into this final act of the game, and I look at it as a separate project of its own. So we're going to be looking at Zen on its own merits, disregarding most of the issues with the rest of the game. So let's talk about Interloper. Interloper is definitely the lowest point of Half-Life, but it does have a few interesting ideas. The chapter begins with a terrible map that I don't even want to talk about, before moving on to a half-baked stealth section coupled with a half-baked piece of story. I say half-baked because while some of the Vortigaunts here are peaceful, others aren't, and there's no indication that this is happening at all anyway. The rest of the chapter is a difficult factory section that doesn't really fit the way these aliens have been portrayed, and feels very rushed. Black Mesa's Interloper skips the first awful map and jumps headfirst into its reimagining of the second. Stealth is gone, but the Vortigaunts are still peaceful. There's a brilliant little scene where a Vortigaunt looks to the player and opens the way for them to proceed, which does a great job of communicating their true nature in a subtle and realistic manner. But apparently this isn't enough to get the point across, because moments before this we got to see this really heavy-handed scene where the alien grunts bully them until they cry. This scene just doesn't need to be here at all. Then we get to walk through this little Vortigaunt village, see all of their pottery and boxes, and get a really good introduction to how the controllers influence them through mind control. After that fight, there's this really big and overblown chase sequence with a ton of gargantuas. There was one here in the original, and it did the job just fine. And then it's on to the factory, and... okay, we need to talk about this technology. This was a little strange in the last 2 chapters, but I just can't ignore it here. It looks like Combine technology. Now, it was always a little weird that the aliens had conveyor belts and barrels, but Black Mesas have pistons, air ducts, holograms, 16:9 flat screen displays, chemical vats, lasers, elevators with buttons, force fields, and plug puzzles. So many plug puzzles. It took this alien factory idea way too far, and the result is a weird cross between Half-Life 2 and Doom Eternal, rather than anything, alien. But this weird choice in visuals is the least of Interloper's problems. Some of the factory is fun, climbing around pipes and shooting at controllers, but most of it is a slog, a very long one, by far the longest chapter in the game, clocking in at nearly an hour and a half. There's a point here where the game just stops giving you ammo for most of the guns, instead giving you an endless supply with the easiest and strongest weapon in the game, so a lot of the chapter is played by just holding the mouse in the general direction of the enemy. There's this awful map with conveyor belts where so much is going on around you that it overloads the senses, and this awful mixture of platforming, fighting things, and trying not to get crushed by all these barrels makes it the worst part of the entire game. And the chapter is capped off with an elevator scene that not only gives you infinite ammo, but infinite health as well. You're standing here, surrounded by lasers, shooting a big blue laser at spinning things while flying monsters throw fireballs at you, and it doesn't even matter because you'll never ever die. Oh well, this over-dramatic music plays. Oh god, I forgot to talk about the music. The music is that it's so good, but it's so loud. It's so loud. Half-Life's final boss isn't very good or well made, but it has one very interesting idea. Since a large focus of the game has been teleportation, the Nihilanth creates portals that teleport the player between 3 small platforming sections. It can get annoying, but sometimes manages to create nice, natural breaks in the intense shooting and dodging of the majority of the fight. There are crystals the player needs to break before Nihilanth takes damage, but it isn't communicated very well. The whole fight is pretty half-baked, but you can tell what they wanted to do and what they might have been able to accomplish with more time. Black Mesa's Nihilanth strips out the only interesting part of the fight in favor of a big, overwhelming bullet hell section that's somehow still way easier than Gonarch was. This baffles me because they've added a few extra phases to the battle, and I can't help but think that making these a bit longer and more challenging, while breaking them up with those platforming sections, could have really turned this into something special. Or better yet, take some ideas from Mark Laidlaw's vignette and turn this into a seamless vertical climax instead. Nihilanth in Black Mesa oddly comes off as more outdated than the original, playing out like a cross between a bad Zelda boss and something from the first Doom. Break the things to open the weak point, shoot the bad guy a bunch, rinse and repeat. Before you know it, Nihilanth is dead and the game is over. The security guard does his best G-Man impression, and then the credits roll. All in all, Black Mesa Zen has more high points than the original, but it never goes very far beyond Half-Life in the fun factor, and it's offset by the waking nightmare of Interloper. All things considered, the game caps off on a pretty boring note, with Nihilanth missing a lot of the intrigue of its original design, and G-Man's ending feeling way too small for how huge and explosive the rest has been. It overstays its welcome, and at the very least, the original Zen was short. But despite everything that I've said about Black Mesa, all of its shortcomings, I would still recommend this to any Half-Life fan. Now, considering I've spent the last 20 minutes complaining about this game, it would be reasonable to think I don't like it, but I do. Black Mesa has a place in the world as one of the most ambitious fan projects ever made, an amazing tribute to one of the best and most important games in history. Remaking something so influential is not an easy task, and Crowbar Collective has managed to make a very, very good game. Some people aren't able to enjoy Half-Life because of its low polygon count or old school movement, but they can play Black Mesa, and I think that's great. More people getting into Half-Life isn't a bad thing just because they're not playing my preferred version. The problem comes in with this idea that the remake can be a replacement of the original, or a superior way to experience it overall. It's not. As I've pointed out, there's a lot that Half-Life does better, or just as well in a different way, and none of this is even taking into account the impact Half-Life has had on the industry and the world as a whole. In my opinion, the best way to play these games is in the order of their release, putting Black Mesa between Episode 2 and Alyx. I think this gives the player a better understanding of the series as a whole, its evolution, and the evolution of the genre. This video isn't meant to tell you that you can't like Black Mesa, because I like Black Mesa, and I hope Crowbar Collective goes on to make more great games. Just don't call it a replacement, because right now, the best way to play Half-Life is Half-Life.